Hi, this is Tim Richardson here. I want to talk about Mintzberg and Porter for our class, talking about classical definitions and understandings of strategy. Now, as you can see over here in the first couple of weeks, we're going to talk about this very famous article by Professor Henry Mintzberg of McGill University called Patterns in Strategy. And then we're also going to talk about Porter's five forces model and the famous arguments that he had there. Now, you may see here a little link saying Porter or Mintzberg discussed by Karl Moore. Moore is a professor at McGill University who's quite well known for talking about strategy and management. This is his web page here, and as you can see, these are the number of different topics that he's taught over the years. He wrote an article in Forbes magazine a very short time ago talking about Porter or Mintzberg, whose view of strategy is the most relevant today. So as part of this discussion about Mintzberg and Porter, we're going to go to that Forbes magazine article, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about what that article was about, using a little bit of narration that I provide here. So first of all, the introduction by Professor Moore says quite emphatically, and I do agree, and many other of my colleagues at UTSC and Department of Management, that the two people, Porter and Mintzberg, are quite well known, and that these are academics that have had, in fact, a real impact on the discussion of strategy. Both have been quite influential, and to many people who have been reading Forbes magazine for a number of years, this is something that's of interest. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about this in the context of what we've been discussing in the course. As you can see here, his comment about Porter is that Porter takes a little bit more deliberate strategy approach, while Mintzberg emphasizes emergent strategy. And we're going to talk about emergent strategy in a little bit. One of the things that Moore talks about is how strategy used to be discussed, and he has a little bit of a story here about going to these sort of executive conferences. And in fact, I remember that myself, because when I was a young business person in the late 1980s and early 90s, that's in fact what we used to do, was go to the Hilton hotels and sit down there with expensive binders and talk about how this company is going to do that, and so on and so on. These days, it's not done that way, partly because there's just too many variables and you don't have the luxury of spending money in that context. The other thing that Moore makes a point about is emergent strategy, given today's world, is on the upswing, and he talks about some of the reasons why. First of all, transparency. One of the reasons why we have more transparency has to do with things such as activist shareholders and social media and more information on the World Wide Web about the activities of companies. And of course, we have to accommodate the changing realities. And the changing realities and how strategy has emerged over time is a consequence of the very fast-moving six environments that we continually harp upon, and of course how companies respond to that to change their 4 Ps. So let's just pause and just remind ourselves. The economic environment on a global context is changing with so many variables. It makes it very difficult to forecast economic analysis with as much accuracy as you used to do it 5-10 years ago. The political environment is in great upheaval as many individual identified groups, whether they be religiously identified, ethnically, socioculturally, economically, etc., are developing more power and more empowerment to be able to voice themselves. The technological environment is moving at a rapid pace with the empowerment to individual people to blog, Skype, post things on Twitter and Facebook, etc. The social cultural environment obviously is an emerging player in how companies have to respond to things around the world, particularly different language groups and social cultural religious practices and so on. And of course the competitive environment, which is a consequence of all these things. And most lastly, the one thing that very few profs seem to talk much about, the geographic environment, which is weather, latitude, cyclones, tornadoes, earthquakes, etc., which is affecting people on a much larger scale than before. So these are some of the reasons why strategies are emerging in response to things not quite the way we used to do strategy in the past, almost in a sterile environment. So this is his point here when he's talking about the relatively stable world has gone the way of the dodo. It seems the world has gone nuts, and he cites all these things here. And of course by 2012 we even have our further examples. We've got the situation of what happened in Egypt and Libya and Syria and so on. And then further here we talk about, so one of the points that I find quite interesting is talking about try as we may control the variables of the factor. It's very, very difficult indeed because there's just too many things to be involved. However, notwithstanding, he says Porter's ideas are still quite relevant and he still teaches them. But the criticism is, of course, that he says they're getting a bit long in the tooth for today's different world. And as we discussed, the 6 environments are one of the reasons why the world is in quite fact different. Henry's emergent strategies, when he's talking about Henry, he's talking about Mintzberg, seem to be more relevant to the world we live in today, and I agree with that. They reflect the fact that our plans will fail. This is one of the things I harp on all the time in business. It's not so matter how successful you're going to be, but are you going to be successful and recover and have business continuity in the face of all these disasters, social upheaval, economic crises we're handling. I firmly believe that businesses that are successful in 2012 and 2013 are not necessarily businesses that plan the perfect production cycle, but rather businesses that have fantastic execution of contingency plans when bad things happen. The point being that success is not necessarily about doing the right thing. It's about avoiding a really, really bad mistake when bad things inevitably happen in business, and that's what's happening more and more these days. Talking about Porter and social responsibility, saying Porter's been working on this corporate social responsibility. Yes, indeed. When I talk to my immediate past former students, those who graduated in 2011 through 2012, and you can hook up with these people on my Facebook group, you'll see a lot of them having things to do with the company that are in response to statements made in the corporate social responsibility of the company, which is in turn a response to activist shareholders and the tyranny of quarterly earnings. This is a very strong influence on how companies behave these days. It's not simply enough to think about your product and your selling and your price point and your competition immediately, but the corporate social responsibility factor affects share price and public opinion of your branding, and these things are very important considerations. The other influence of corporate social responsibility is social media. At the top of my website you see the links for YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, there's also Foursquare and many other things like that, and the blogging and so on. Many companies these days are not so much concerned about www.royalbank.com, they're concerned about www.facebook.com/royalbank, because it's in response to these types of social media situations that their share prices are moving, and that people think about whether they will or will not, respond to recruitment for the company and so on. So this article in Forbes magazine is quite short, but it's very interesting, and you have to read it after you've read the piece on Mintzberg and looked at the piece by Porter, because then you can put these two things into context. I hope that that's helpful.